Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future. Today, we have reached the last episode in our full series about the great political fictions. We started with Shakespeare's Coriolanus, and we're going to end with Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton. We're ending here because it is, for reasons that I hope to try to convey, I think, one of the great political fictions of our time. Hamilton is clearly different from the other novels and plays that I've been talking about in this series because it is not a novel and it is not a play. It is a musical, and musicals are different because there's more going on in a musical than just the words or the lyrics or the book, as it's called. There's everything. There is the music, there is the dance, the choreography, and it does come as a package. And if you see Hamilton, you experience it as a package. I've seen it live once in the West End with a cast that were largely British, but did an amazing job, I think, of recreating the Broadway version. And it is completely mesmerizing. It is compelling, but it's not, I think, maybe even mainly compelling because of the words. It's compelling because of the way all of it is seamlessly woven together. I've also seen, as I think a lot of people have, the filmed recording of the original Broadway version, that is with the original cast, many of the people who became famous because of Hamilton, including Lin-Manuel Miranda himself in that filmed version, playing the part of Hamilton as he did off-Broadway and on Broadway for a while, and others like Leslie Odom Jr. and Philippa Soo and Daveed Diggs and Jonathan Groff, celebratedly playing King George III. I think he's on stage for 9 minutes, but he almost stole the show. And that's mesmerizing as well. It's not quite the same as seeing it live, but it's extraordinary. And yet, I have to be frank up front here, I'm going to be talking about the words primarily here, about the book. I'm not really going to be talking about, certainly not the dance or the choreography or really the music, although I'll refer to the genres in which I think it's written. And I'm going to be talking about a particular version of the book. So there is an edition of the lyrics of Hamilton, which was put together by Lin-Manuel Miranda and a friend and collaborator of his called Jeremy McCarter. It's called Hamilton the Revolution. Some of it's quite schmaltzy. It's about the creation of the musical, and it tells some of the tales of backstage excitement. But it also contains all of the words with notes from Miranda about some of his inspirations, some of the things that he tried to do, some of the things that he changed, where some of the ideas came from. It's pretty interesting, and it's quite full. There are quite a lot of notes explaining what's going on. And it also contains some bits that were cut from the final version of the musical, including one scene in particular that I want to talk about towards the end, because I think it does, had it been included, potentially change the shape of this musical. It changes its character a little bit. The other thing to say about Hamilton is it is, of course, the most recent of all of these fictions that I've been talking about. It was first performed in its current version, as close as possible to its current version, off-Broadway at the beginning of 2015. And then it moved quite quickly to Broadway. It was immediately surrounded by a huge amount of hype and excitement. It was a smash hit straight away. It was a smash hit almost before it had even arrived. It became a cultural phenomenon, an enormous money spinner. It made some of those people I talked about famous, above all, Miranda himself. It's less than a decade old. And yet, weirdly, it already feels like it belongs to another era. So much has happened in that decade. And so much that has happened in that decade has changed the way that people think about this musical, this fiction. I'm going to call it a fiction. Well, I'll talk a bit about the extent to which it's also interesting history. So much has happened that changes how people feel about this musical. It almost feels like it's dated, but it's also still very much alive. And that's partly what I want to talk about in this episode. It is very much identified with the Obama era, and the Obama era does feel like a long time ago. So I should say I'm recording this on the afternoon after last night, and last night Donald Trump was nearly assassinated. We think very nearly assassinated. I don't know much yet about, any more than anyone else does, about what happened. But whatever happened last night, may have changed American politics again. Who knows? But it feels like maybe another era is about to begin. But a lot of eras have begun and maybe even ended even within that decade. So the Obama era, with which Hamilton was first identified, feels a long time ago. And actually the musical, though it finally appeared in public towards the end of the Obama years, was associated with Obama throughout. So the first time a version of any of this appears in public is in a celebrated moment that happened at the White House, and it's been watched many, many millions of times on YouTube. It was in May 2009, so not that long after the Obamas moved into the White House, just a few months into Obama's first term. There was an evening of poetry and music at the White House, and Lin-Manuel Miranda was invited to perform. He was already well known for his first musical, In the Heights, and I think it was thought that he was going to perform. He certainly says that he was given the impression they wanted him to play a couple of songs from that musical, but he thought he would try out the thing that he had just started working on, which he describes, I think, as a hip-hop concept album, though I think he already knew it was going to probably end up as a musical, but at this point it was called, or was going to be called, the Hamilton Mixtape. A hip-hop concept album about the life of Alexander Hamilton, the founding father. And he says this in Obama's White House to an invited audience, quite a small audience, that includes Barack and Michelle Obama. And they laugh. Everybody laughs because it's such an outlandish idea, a hip-hop musical about Alexander Hamilton. And Lin-Manuel Miranda laughs because he knows how ridiculous it is. And then he performs, just with the accompaniment of the piano, a version. He raps, effectively, what becomes the first song in the musical, the one that contains the line, "My name is Alexander Hamilton." And his audience are immediately completely astonished, mesmerized, gripped. Michelle Obama starts clicking her fingers. Barack Obama smiles and rubs his chin, and his face lights up. And at the end, he's the first to stand and give Miranda a standing ovation. It only lasts for 4 minutes. So already in May 2009, whatever this thing was going to be is associated with the Obamas. And the Obamas come and see it. They come and see it off Broadway. They come and see it on Broadway. Barack Obama addresses the cast. And everyone at the time felt that this musical and the Obama years were a great fit, because the thing that stood out from the off about this musical is that it was a retelling of the story of the founding of America with non-white actors playing the parts of the founding fathers. And this is in the age of America's first black president. Here was a musical in which the part of George Washington was played by a black actor. And it felt like it was of a piece. And it also was seen at the time to be not just an optimistic, but a kind of euphoric take on a version of America and American history that suited the Obama years. The things that Obama was thought to represent, particularly early on. Obama launched himself on American public consciousness in 2004 at the Democratic National Convention, where he gave a celebrated speech in which he used his own life story, Kenyan father, American mother, the way in which he himself embodied the melting pot that is America. And the fact that he could potentially, at that point he didn't know it, but it already felt like it could happen, wind up as president, symbolized something about this country and the fulfillment of its promise. And that promise seemed to be there in the retelling of the founding in this musical. It felt like it was a fit, but it was already right towards the end of the Obama years. And a lot of that promise had already dissipated. And the Obama years, as they came to an end, did not necessarily feel anything like as optimistic as they had done for many people at the beginning. And not that long after Hamilton launched, within a couple of years, it was the Trump years. And the character of the musical and what it represented seemed to change. So it went from being something that could be viewed as a celebration of some aspect of American political life now, to being, for many people, part of the resistance. So there was a celebrated performance, a notorious performance, in the period between Donald Trump's election and his inauguration, when the vice president-elect Mike Pence attended it. And he was singled out and jeered, and the audience were very aware of his presence, and so were the cast. And then at the end, the cast directed some comments at Mike Pence, thereby provoking a pretty furious response from Donald Trump himself. And suddenly, here is Hamilton, the musical, whatever it was that it symbolized, it now seems to symbolize something against the current of American politics. But so much has changed even since then. You just have to look at the arc of the political life of Mike Pence. If Mike Pence at that point, at the end of 2016, was the thing being resisted, Mike Pence is now, in a very attenuated way, part of the resistance, because Mike Pence resisted the role that had been carved out for him by Donald Trump on January the 6th, or prior, I should say, to January the 6th, 2021. As vice president, he was meant to help Trump resist the results of the election, and he wouldn't play that role. And Pence is now a critic. It has to be said, a failed critic of Donald Trump, because his career has gone nowhere. But nonetheless, he is not the character that he was at the end of 2016. He doesn't symbolize the same things as he did. From the Trump years to the Biden years, American politics feels like it's shifting its character again. And now it's the morning after, or the afternoon after, the night before. And I don't think anyone has any idea where this story is going. But Hamilton has been sort of dragged along behind in this extraordinary switchback era of American politics, back and forth. And the way people read it has really depended on the mood of the moment. I don't see any sign of that ending. I don't know how long Hamilton's going to run. It's running all over the world. It's still running in the West End. It's still running on Broadway. I imagine it will continue to run. And as it continues to run, it will be experienced differently by people depending on what's going on. And at the same time, over that period, it's also played a role, quite a significant role, in cultural politics. I don't want to use the phrase the culture wars, but it is part of the cultural politics of America and the wider world. It's become a touchstone, and that was true right from the beginning. So from the very beginning, there was some suspicion of Hamilton because Obama was a huge fan, but so it was discovered was Dick Cheney, George W. Bush's vice president, before Trump, probably the preeminent villain of American politics for those on the other side. He symbolized everything that was wrong with the Republican Party, more even than George W. Bush. But Cheney apparently absolutely loved Hamilton. Well, if Cheney loved it, it doesn't matter that Obama loved it. If Cheney loved it, something had to be wrong with it. And it wasn't long before many people started to point out what they thought was wrong with it. And for many of its critics, what was wrong with it was that it was superficially radical and different, but actually it was deeply conservative. And it was using Black actors and a retelling of the American founding to conceal the fact that the story itself and the presentation of the story was highly conventional and also didn't make anywhere near enough of an effort to genuinely retell or radicalize the story of the American founding. Let me just read one quote from the many, there really are a huge number of critiques and indeed takedowns of Hamilton and everything that it represents. Here's just one line from one of them. Hamilton uses the talents, bodies, and voices of Black artists to mask an erasure of people of color from the actual story of the American founding. It is sometimes in these critiques called blackwashing, it's sometimes called whitewashing, but the idea is that actually nothing about this musical is that different if you get past what is superficially so different about it. Here's a Black George Washington, here's a Black Thomas Jefferson, and that it avoids talking about all of the difficult questions, above all the question of slavery that I'm going to come back to, but other questions too. And that accusation has dogged Hamilton throughout. The arc of its gestation from 2009 through to its first performance in 2015 was also the era of the financial crash and its aftermath. It was the era of Occupy Wall Street. Here is a musical that takes as its central character the man who founded America's financial system, who allowed the American federal government to take on debt, which is the basis of modern American finance, and who was also, and he's described as such in the musical, a friend of Wall Street. That's how he is characterized. And this in the age of Occupy Wall Street. Where was the critique of that? We get Thomas Jefferson's critique of Hamilton, but in many respects in this, we are sort of seeing it from Hamilton's point of view. We're not necessarily meant to be on Hamilton's side, but it is pretty sympathetic, as you would imagine it would be, to its central character. It's also, as many people have noticed, a musical whose sexual politics are at the very best not what some people might like them to be. There are strands of misogyny in this musical. It has some well-known and celebrated female characters, particularly the Schuyler sisters, one of whom Hamilton marries, one of whom he doesn't marry, and they are portrayed pretty much in the round, and it is a sympathetic portrayal. But This is mainly a story of men often boasting and bragging about women as add-ons to the story, certainly primarily add-ons to the political story. And then there's one number in particular, whose name is Say No to This, when Hamilton sings about how a woman came to see him and he was unable to say no to her appeal, and he ends up going to bed with her, and then he ends up getting blackmailed. And he portrays himself as the victim. I don't know how to say no to this. And a lot of people have found that one in particular pretty hard to take. There are lots of things to be said about the way Hamilton has been used in this set of arguments about culture and cultural politics. But I do think it is worth reiterating, and I keep almost lapsing into the language of wanting to call this a play or a fiction or a book, but it is a musical. This is musical theatre, and it's musical theatre that tries to bring together two genres, one of which is classic Broadway musical theatre, and the other of which is hip-hop. This is a hip-hop musical. And the thing about those two genres is they are, in their different ways, quite small c conservative about some of these things. Hip-hop is, in many of its instances, pretty misogynistic. That number, Say No to This, Miranda says in his notes to it, it was inspired partly by LL Cool J. I mean, you wouldn't look to LL Cool J for enlightened, I don't think you would look to LL Cool J for enlightened sexual politics. These men are rapping, they are using the language, the idiom of hip-hop. So of course they're bragging about women. Of course they are dismissive in various ways of women. Of course this is a male world. It's one of the reasons why that musical genre seems to fit. Miranda's not claiming this is anything other than an attempt to fit together two genres that seem weirdly to go together, one of which is the story of the American founding and the other of which is hip-hop. And one of the reasons they go together is precisely that these men talking in that way seems to fit both. It's also true that Broadway musical theatre is often small c conservative. It has a narrative arc about men and women and the relations between them that is not necessarily particularly enlightened. And in this musical, some of the songs are very conventional Broadway musical kinds of songs. I think the one that most people find most moving in Hamilton is towards the end. It's called It's Quiet Uptown, and it's the song that Hamilton sings in the aftermath of the killing of his eldest son, Philip, in a duel. He is by that point estranged from his wife, Eliza, because of his affair that has been revealed. But surprisingly and deeply movingly, they reconcile, and they reconcile in the aftermath of the death of their eldest child. And it's incredibly moving. It's hard to watch it, I think, and not be moved by it. But it's also deeply conventional. It very much feels like a resolution song in a Broadway musical in which a man and a woman who have, for whatever reason, been pulled apart, come back together again. And it's the man's version that we get. It's a hip-hop musical. It's a musical. And that's also true, I think, of one of the other criticisms that is often made. The response is, it's a musical, because many people have attacked Hamilton for not being historically accurate, that it plays fast and loose with the history. And it says something extraordinary, I think, about the hype surrounding it, that there should be any surprise that it plays fast and loose with the history. It is celebratedly based on and inspired by a work of history, Ron Chernow's popular biography of Hamilton. So some professional academic historians are pretty snooty about that book because it's a popular biography, enormously successful even before Miranda made it even more widely read and successful. There's a kind of origin myth about Hamilton, which is that he took it on holiday, I think, to Mexico, and he was reading it by the pool, and there's a photograph of Miranda by the pool in Mexico with this book, this fat biography of Hamilton, open on his lap. And there was a light bulb moment where he thought, amazingly, wow, you could make a hip-hop musical out of this story. In the version that I'm reading, which includes Miranda's notes and reminiscences, it's pointed out that that origin myth isn't true because Miranda and his collaborator on this book both remember discussing the possibility of making a musical about Hamilton based on Chernow's book before Miranda took that holiday. So he has mythologized it. The light bulb moment didn't happen. They both say what probably happened is that he glanced at this book that he was thinking of taking on holiday and immediately started thinking, this is an interesting story. What could you do with it? And it was on holiday that the idea came together. Nonetheless, because it's based on a serious work of history, though some historians think not serious enough, it's often said, but it doesn't live up to those standards. It's not as accurate as you would expect a biography to be. It's a musical. It's hard to think of other musicals that are held to that standard. To be honest, it's hard to think of any musicals that are held to that standard. I'm going to be talking at a future date about Evita. I don't think Evita is held to that standard. It's partly because Miranda himself clearly has some serious ambitions here. It is an extraordinarily intricate, complicated, and detailed piece of writing that has an amazing amount of historical detail in it, and it draws on a lot of primary sources. So there are direct quotations in the lyrics of this hip-hop musical from Washington's farewell address and from the Reynolds pamphlet and from the Federalist Papers. So unlike most musicals, it does at least have pretensions to some kind of historical authenticity. But at the same time, Miranda is completely open about the fact that he had to craft something that worked in the shape of a musical, that followed the arc of a musical. And of course, he had to make some shortcuts with the historical facts. So a couple of the examples that he gives where he says, I know this isn't historically accurate. One concerns the Schuyler sisters, so Angelica and Eliza and Peggy, the three sisters, the daughters of Philip Schuyler, a wealthy man, a successful New York man. And here are these three daughters. And Hamilton first meets one of them and then is introduced to another one whom he marries. Peggy drops out of the story. But the way it's presented is almost like they're the Bennet sisters in Pride and Prejudice. Here's this man who's got these unmarried daughters and he needs to marry them off. He needs to marry them off for the continuation of whatever it is that he thinks his family line is going to involve. He can't have these unmarried daughters. And they're presented as essentially his only children. And in one of the songs where Angelica has to rationalize her decision, though she wants Hamilton for herself, to pass him on to her sister, is that she knows her job as the eldest is to make a good marriage and so on. And as Miranda says, none of that is true. Schuyler had 8 children. They weren't all women. He had 2 sons. This was a much bigger family. The Schuyler sisters weren't a unit in that way, but it works. It works for the musical. It's a big part of the arc of the musical, the Schuyler sisters as a unit, and who they marry and how they marry and why they marry being explained in those terms. But it's not true. The same applies to the bit later on in the musical surrounding the death of the Hamilton son, Philip, in a duel, aged, I think, 19. This terrible event that both foreshadows the death of his father in a duel at the end, but also breaks his parents and then allows them to reconcile. And throughout the whole of the musical, Philip is portrayed more or less as an only child. He is the firstborn and he is the focus of their attention. But his loss is portrayed, if not as the loss of an only child, certainly as an only son. Everything is focused on this boy. And when this boy is taken away, it's as though they have lost the central unit in their family. And they reconfigure the family around the loss of the only son. But as Miranda freely confesses, this isn't true. He wasn't the only son. Like the Schuylers, the Hamiltons had 8 children, and there is no hint of that here. And they had a lot of other sons. Actually, I think, so the Schuylers of the 8, 2 were boys, but for the Hamiltons, 6 of them were boys. And the next 3, Alexander Jr., James Hamilton and John Hamilton, born after Philip, lived respectively to the ages of 89, 90, and 90. They all had very successful public lives and public careers. And John Hamilton, for a brief time, was acting Secretary of State. The Hamiltons did found a dynasty. It didn't go through their eldest son, Philip, but there were plenty of other children. At the end, we are really given the vision following Hamilton's death of Eliza Hamilton, his widow, channeling her sense of what comes next through the orphanage that she founded. And maybe she did, I don't know. But she did still have the other children as well, and they are erased from this story. But it's a musical. It seems to me that's fine. It's not claiming to tell the whole story, the truth and nothing but the truth. There's another bit which is very effective in the musical, and it relates to a real historical document, the Federalist Papers, that Hamilton co-wrote with James Madison and John Jay, but John Jay had to drop out. So Hamilton ended up writing a lot of the Federalist Papers. Most were written by him, and it's part of the theme here, which is that Hamilton writes a lot, maybe too much. He's always writing. in the words of Hamilton, like he's running out of time. But the suggestion here is that his rival and his ultimate nemesis, Aaron Burr, is one of the people that Hamilton persuades or tries to persuade to join him in writing the Federalist Papers. He offers him the opportunity to write some of them himself, and Burr says no, and it's a consistent theme here. Hamilton and Burr are contrasted. Hamilton is the man who writes too much, but Burr is the cautious one. Burr, from the beginning, is the one who says, don't let them know what you're against and what you're for. Burr's fear is that if he commits himself to the Federalist Papers, which defend the Federalist viewpoint of the new American Constitution, he is committing himself to a side. Hamilton is always committing himself to a side. He changes sides, but he's always taking a side. The joke, if it is a joke, the motif is that Burr never wants to be committed to one side or the other. He wants to play both sides. So Burr says no to the opportunity of writing or co-writing the Federalist Papers. As Miranda says, that almost certainly never happened. It could have happened. With this one, he says it could have happened. He's aware that Hamilton did ask around to try and find people to lighten the load. So maybe one of the people he alighted on who said no was Aaron Burr, but there's no evidence that that happened. It works really well in the musical. It's not claiming to be accurate history, but it is claiming to bring that history alive. And I think it does. I think it successfully does bring it alive. And one of the reasons that it brings it alive is that it captures the fluidity of it. There are a lot of switches and changes in allegiance and political identity throughout Hamilton in the period that it covers, from the Revolutionary War through to Hamilton's death just at the dawn of the 19th century. But those crucial final 2 decades of the 18th century in particular, when the American Republic was forming itself, it was incredibly unformed and fluid. And Hamilton captures just how fluid it was. And I think it partly is able to do that because it feels very young. These are, to start with, young men. And even in the meat of the political action, in the founding of the Republic and then the politics that follows from that, they're still, at most, young, middle-aged men. One of the oddities of the Founding Fathers is that, with the exception of Hamilton, they all grew old. One of the motifs of Hamilton is Hamilton's own sense of his own mortality. From the very beginning, he talks about death just being one step ahead of him. And he repeats that refrain following his receipt of the fatal wound in his duel with Burr. Death is always just there ahead of him. And this is almost used to make him stand out from the others. Because the thing that we know about the others is that they were all going to have really weirdly long lives. It's a bit like Hamilton's sons who lived into their 80s or 90s. Burr and Madison and Jefferson and John Adams all lived into their 80s and their 90s. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson famously died on the same day, July the 4th, 1824. Adams was in his 90s by that point. They all had long lives, afterlives. Even George Washington, who didn't live to be as old as the others, I think he was 69 when he died, but he still had a retirement. Hamilton's the only one who's taken out of the story in the middle of the story. And it's his story, so it has that feeling that all of this is actually not going to be set in stone. So the Founding Fathers are eventually, and in most cases, literally set in stone, some of them on Mount Rushmore, as relatively old men. And the image of them is often as older, in some cases elderly men, but they weren't. They were young at the start of the story in the Revolutionary War. They're incredibly young. Hamilton is just out of his teens. And death is just ahead for all of them. This was an incredibly dangerous time, not just because of war, but because of disease. People were being taken all the time. Philadelphia in summer, let alone Washington in summer, were really unhealthy places to be. There were often outbreaks of fatal disease, which would take people from one day to the next. Death should haunt this story, but in the retelling much later, it almost never does. There's an inevitability about these men, these so-called extraordinary men, with their extraordinary lives. It's almost an accident of history, I think, that they had these amazingly long lives. And yet Hamilton's death is the one that's treated as the great accident. It wasn't disease, it wasn't war, it was a completely, probably unnecessary duel that leads to him being taken out. But telling the story through the one who does die does recapture the sense in which, for them living through it, they didn't know they were going to be set in stone, any of them. There is an urgency to it and an uncertainty to it that is really well captured, I think, in the way Miranda presents it. He says in his notes that Hamilton's sense of his mortality is the thing that he, Lin-Manuel Miranda, most identifies with. So he says of himself, Miranda, that bit is autobiographical. It's about him. He feels that death is just ahead of him. He is writing like he's running out of time. He has a strong sense, Miranda does, that you've got to get things done because you never know which day is going to be your last, which is quite surprising given he's living in the 21st century. He's not living in the late 18th century. Death is not ahead of most people in his situation. I have no idea. It might have something to do with one of the mythic stories of contemporary Broadway and great tragedies of contemporary Broadway, which is that Jonathan Larson, the creator of Rent, a musical from a couple of decades before Hamilton, but revolutionary, not a hip-hop musical, a rock musical, but still contemporary and revolutionary in something like the same way that Hamilton was, in that case about gay life and AIDS. And Larson died on opening night of a completely unforeseen heart attack. It's thought because of undiagnosed Marfan syndrome, the great tragedy of contemporary American Broadway. Whether that's what haunts Miranda, I don't know. But it is also true that it's another way in which the story of these men at the end of the 18th century does suit hip-hop, because if there is a genre where death is just ahead of many of the artists that Miranda draws on, and he says he's drawing on Tupac and Notorious B.I.G., Biggie Smalls, and these are people who died. And they died in ways not dissimilar to the way that Hamilton died. And the language of this musical, the hip-hop version of American history, does feel like it's a good way of bringing alive the way in which this is a story that is shot through with death. I think the other thing that makes it good history, that is bringing history alive, is what it has to say about the formation of the American party system. So that really is the least promising subject for a musical imaginable. I think if he'd said at the White House in 2009, I'm writing a hip-hop musical about the formation of the American party system, he really would have been laughed off stage. And yet that is partly what Hamilton is about. And it's brilliant on it because it does tell the story, a complicated story. It has numbers in it called things like the Adams administration or the election of 1800. In the episode that Gary Gerstle and I recorded for our American election series about the election of 1800, that's where we started. We used as one of our texts the lyrics from the election of 1800 in Madison because it's an amazingly effective, condensed version of what happened there. And what happened there, as with the rest of the formation of the party system in America, is that the politics of party was profoundly shaped by personal relationships and personal animosities. The Republic was founded by men who believed that party and partisanship were anathema. And the Constitution was partly drafted in order to try and do whatever could be done to keep party and partisanship at some remove from the heart of American politics. It was a complete failure in that regard. Within not minutes, but months, and certainly years, a party system formed out of the politics of different readings of the Constitution and what it meant. And America has been a partisan and party-based system ever since. And it started here, but it was not fully formed at this point. These parties were real and the animosities between them were ferocious. But they also turned on these personal relationships, and therefore, as personal relationships turned, so the party system itself had to turn. It was dependent on how these men felt about each other. And that's particularly true of Hamilton, who really shaped much of the early American party system. So in that song, The Election of 1800, he supports Jefferson, and in supporting Jefferson, he turns the party system on its head. But even in the previous one, the Adams administration, Jefferson is elated because Hamilton, in one of his many attempts to take down people that he's had enough of because he writes too much, like he's running out of time, launches a vicious attack on President John Adams. And as Jefferson gleefully points out, they're in the same party. He's destroyed the leader of his party. That's party politics in the age of Hamilton. But it feels weirdly contemporary. So this seems to me one bit about this musical that is more resonant now than it was in the age of Obama. Obama early on, and the idealized Obama, who was for many people associated with the origins of Hamilton, was still hoped by some people to be the post-partisan president. He wasn't, and post-partisanship died fairly early on in Obama's presidency, but nonetheless, for some at least, that's what he symbolized. We're now living in an age, the age of Biden and Trump, in which party politics is deeply personal, and it seems to hang on personal relationships and personal identities. Both parties, the Republican Party for a while now has been in thrall to a man and his life and the arc of his life and where it goes next. And so what happened yesterday shapes the future for the American body politic. But the Democratic Party too, just in the last few weeks, but maybe months and maybe years, has been held hostage by the life story of Joe Biden. Indeed, the natural life arc of Joe Biden, the aging of a single human being, has trapped American politics in its orbit. The party turns on Joe Biden's age. His age isn't refracted through party dynamics. It's the other way round. His age is the central question. What he thinks about himself, how he understands himself and his own identity in a way that feels still completely consistent with party politics, and the party either will or won't turn with him. And I have no idea where that story is going to go. But it feels like politics of the late 18th century, just in that respect. It's these men and their relationship on which all of this partisanship turns. The exception to that in the Hamilton story is George Washington. George Washington is the father figure to these young men. He is the founding father in this story to these boys, these squabbling boys. And often he treats them like squabbling boys, particularly Hamilton and Burr and Jefferson. And George Washington is the one person who takes himself out of the story deliberately. Hamilton is removed from the story by force. The others aren't going anywhere. But Washington retires. And it's a great sequence where Washington calls Hamilton and asks Hamilton to help him compose his farewell address, in which he talks about the need for the Republic to be something more than the story of the life arc of one man. And here we are in 2024, trapped in the stories of the life arcs of two men. But Washington seems to be the person who symbolizes how America is going to get beyond that. There was an editorial in the New York Times, I think just 10 days ago, saying Joe Biden needs to rewatch or reread or re-encounter, assuming he has encountered it, Hamilton, and go back to the bit where Washington works out why it is so important to step away rather than to cling on to the bitter end, to cling on, as it was assumed Washington would do, right the way through till death. If Biden would read this, Hamilton could teach Biden how to retire. That is, Hamilton's Washington could teach Biden how to retire. I have to say it's quite a stretch. I wouldn't go that far. I'm not sure actually it does apply. It was easy for Washington to retire because when Washington stepped away, it wasn't at that point, though it would within years become as contentious, but it wasn't at that point as contentious who might succeed him. It was baffling. There's the great line where George III, when told that Washington has stepped away, he can't believe it. He's a king. He assumed Washington was a king, and kings don't retire, but Washington has. And he says, who comes next? And he's told John Adams. And his incredulity is hilarious. He remembers little round John Adams. Nonetheless, from Washington to Adams was relatively non-contentious. The contention comes next time, the election of 1800, the first truly, viciously, unbelievably viciously partisan election. Jefferson versus Adams primarily. The insults, the slanders, the threats. It's amazing it didn't end in a duel. It easily could have done. But Washington precedes that. It's not clear that Biden is in Washington's world. Biden is in the world of Adams versus Jefferson. And of course, the other difference is that Washington is the old man in this story, and he steps away, leaving by this point the middle-aged men, but some of whom are behaving like children, to run the show. What's so extraordinary, as everyone observes about American politics now, is that this is being played out as though these two men were either young, hungry, angry, paranoid founding fathers, or frankly, feuding hip-hop artists. And yet one of them's 78 and the other one is 81. And what makes American politics now so thoroughly bizarre is that it is the personalization of politics, vicious, contentious, increasingly violent personalization of politics, refracted through men who are much, much, much older than Washington was when he stepped away. Indeed, through men for whom, in both cases, for all sorts of reasons, including what happened yesterday, but by no means limited to what happened yesterday, have death just one step ahead of them. Will they survive another term is a real live question in a way that it wasn't even for George Washington. So I don't think in that case the analogy holds. American politics now is weirder than in 1800. The big critique of Hamilton is that it airbrushes slavery out of the story. So it doesn't, in the sense that slavery comes up a bit, not a lot, but a bit, and certainly in the version that we have, Hamilton is portrayed as broadly being anti-slavery, and it's one of the things that he uses to attack Thomas Jefferson and the Southerners, the Virginians, generally, Jefferson and Madison and others, leaving aside Washington's relationship to that. So there is a sort of only vaguely articulated, but a sense in this that Hamilton's on the right side of history, which is one of the reasons why he can be the hero of this story, as opposed to Jefferson in particular, who is on the wrong side of history. And this infuriates many of the critics of Hamilton. It infuriates them because it is so simplistic and, it's not fully articulated, but also it gives Hamilton far too easy a ride. Hamilton, the character, the man, Alexander Hamilton. Because Hamilton's relationship with slavery was deeply complicated and compromised and complicit. He married into the Schuyler family, and the Schuyler family, though based in New York, owned slaves. He was part of it. They were all part of it. This was a country whose constitution institutionalized slavery and indeed declared that enslaved Americans were 3/5 of a person. They'd all signed up to this thing. Hamilton was the great defender of that constitution. So the idea that somehow this musical, which is now what most people know about Hamilton, presents him as the good guy on the right side of history is infuriating. But it's also true that there was going to be more about slavery in it. So by far the most interesting bit that was cut out is the third cabinet battle, which never appears. So there are two cabinet battles in Hamilton where Hamilton and Jefferson have a kind of rap battle about a great issue of the day. So the first one is about the financial system and the federalization of the debt. Hamilton gives his point of view. Jefferson gives his point of view. They're laced with insults and takedowns. It's brilliant. It's hilarious. It's extraordinary the way that it does weave in some of the general questions of financialization into this almost cartoonish version of American history. And then the second one of these is about the new republic's relationship with France. Revolutionary France is going to war with Britain. Jefferson and others who remember Lafayette's service to the American Republic at its birth and sees the French Revolution as a kindred event. The American Revolution wants the new American Republic to join this European war on the side of the French. Hamilton does not want that to happen at all. He thinks that the new Republic needs to consolidate its own position and stay out of European entanglements. In both cases, Hamilton wins the argument, though Jefferson has some of the best and funniest lines, and Washington more or less allows Hamilton his way. And there's a third version of this, the slavery debate, Cabinet Battle number 3, as it was called. And it doesn't make it into the final musical. I don't know why, probably because the musical's already too long. As Miranda says, Hamilton in Hamilton has more lines than Lear does in King Lear. So you can't really give him that many more. But I think it's a shame it didn't get in because I don't know if it would address the criticism, but it does do something on the question of slavery that this musical does for some of these other questions, which is it shows just how, in a way, contentious it was even then, but also how complicit they all were. They were all complicit in a way in all of this. If you like it, it means they're all great. But if you don't like it, it does mean they're all really not great. I just want to read a bit of it because it's not in the final version. So in the slavery debate that Miranda wrote but didn't include, Jefferson says this: "For the Southern states to participate in our little independence escapade, we made concessions to the South to make them less afraid. You take away our property, secession talk will escalate. But for a second, let us say that we can legislate unanimous emancipation. Freedom reigns, and yes, it's great. We cannot cure prejudice or righteous desperate hate. So, back to Africa? Or do they get a separate state? It's a sin. It's growing like a cancer. But we can't address the question if we do not have an answer." So Jefferson, that is in a way the classic defense, which is we know it's wrong, but the time isn't right to do anything about it. And actually, in a way, it's the price that we paid for being able to found this republic at all. If you wanted to bind the South and the North together, this is the price. And Hamilton's response is this: institutionalizing slavery only multiplies our troubles. Wait till the 1800s and their population doubles. You all know this is the stain on our soul and democracy. A land of the free? No, it's not. It's hypocrisy. To subjugate, dehumanize a race, call them property, and say that we are powerless to stop it. Can you not foresee, sir, even you, Jefferson, you have hundreds of slaves whose descendants will curse our names when we're safe in our graves? How will the South find labor for its businesses? How will Thomas Jefferson find his next mistresses? Actually, reading it, it might be that Sir, even you was going to be directed at Washington, not at Jefferson. But Jefferson's argument is now is not the time, and Hamilton's riposte is, you people say it's never the time, but the longer we wait, the harder it's going to get. You are institutionalizing it. You are integrating it in the economy of the South. How will the South find labor for its businesses? But also, you, Thomas Jefferson, are complicit in all sorts of ways. How will Thomas Jefferson find his next mistresses? And then Madison steps in and he touches on Hamilton's two weak points. So Hamilton is addressed by Madison as follows. Hamilton, if we support emancipation, every single slave owner will demand compensation. And as for slandering Jefferson with talk of mistresses, do you really wanna? Hamilton's two weak points are it'll cost money. That's going to make you nervous, Alexander Hamilton. And secondly, don't you be throwing around accusations for hypocrisy. We know by this point that Hamilton's own marriage is compromised. Don't you be throwing around accusations of hypocrisy. No one is going to win if this becomes a contest of hypocrisy. Madison and Jefferson say to Hamilton, do you really want to have that conversation? And Hamilton says no. So this is the cabinet battle that Hamilton loses. And he loses because he recognizes he is complicit too. Washington, I've heard enough, gentlemen. You can go. Slavery's too volatile an issue. We won't get it through. Madison, sir, we'll keep it off your desk. Washington, good. Do it. I don't know what difference it would have made to Hamilton if that scene had been included, but what that scene seems to me effectively to do is it at least doesn't allow people to say that this whitewashes Hamilton, the character Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton loses that argument because he is too compromised. And the argument, as with many of the political arguments that are reconstructed here, does do a good job of capturing just how much the complexity here was to do with timing. In a way, they can all pay lip service to the idea that slavery is a bad thing, even Jefferson. The question is when and how, not what, but when and how. And they're all torn on that question. And when people are torn on the question of timing, the easiest thing often is to do nothing and hope that time will take care of it, which it didn't. So Hamilton was right in one sense, where he says here, if we do nothing now, in the end, over time, this problem is going to get worse because the South is going to become dependent on this way of enriching itself. But Hamilton is also wrong because he is not in a position to make that argument. I want to say a couple of last things about Hamilton. There is so much more that could be said. One is that this is only one version of the founding story. Not only that, this is only one version of the story of the central characters. So the three central characters in Miranda's Hamilton are Hamilton, Burr, the man who shot him, and Jefferson, his arch political rival, but the man he ends up endorsing in this version and enabling to become president. And we see it primarily through Hamilton's eyes. They're all, in their way, quite sympathetically portrayed, but this is Hamilton's story. And it ends with Hamilton's death. But there are very different ways of telling this story, including very different fictional ways, fictionalized ways of telling this story, of which perhaps the best and most celebrated that could easily be a subject in this series and maybe a subject in the next one is Gore Vidal's celebrated novel Burr, about Aaron Burr, published in 1973, which tells of much the same history and the same triangular relationship, Burr, Hamilton, Jefferson. But Burr is the central character. And the difference that making Burr the central character makes is, first of all, the story is much longer because Burr lives for a long time after the duel. Hamilton is shot, but Burr has a long and complicated afterlife. And many things happen to him, many more notorious things happen to him, even in a way than the duel. It makes Burr a more sympathetic character because Gore Vidal is funny about him and brings him to life. He's a bit of a deliberate mystery in Hamilton the musical. The point of him is that he is deliberately opaque and not to be trusted and in it for himself. He is all of those things in Gore Vidal's version, but he's also fully alive and cynical, and he's an adventurer, and you want to go along with him for the ride. But the other thing that Gore Vidal's story does is it makes the central relationship not the relationship between Hamilton and Burr or between Hamilton and Jefferson. The central relationship in that telling is between Burr and Jefferson. Burr, who was Jefferson's vice president. The killing of Hamilton is a big part of Burr's story, but it's almost incidental to the central drama, which is Burr's loathing of Jefferson, who is eviscerated in Gore Vidal's telling as a hypocrite, not just because of slavery, but because he was a pompous, priggish arsehole. And everything about him was loathsome in that version. He was the man who pretended to be an intellectual. He was the man who pretended to be above politics at the same time as pretending to understand the common man. And Burr sees it all as a giant lie. He can't bear him. And the drama continues long after the duel with Hamilton. The Burr conspiracy during Jefferson's presidency, Jefferson, who also loathes Burr, attempting to take him down. And there's the great trial of Aaron Burr on charges of treason. And a jury acquits him, to Jefferson's rage and frustration. It's like contemporary lawfare. They try and take him out of politics by convicting him of treason. And a jury acquits Burr. And so he continues to have an afterlife. He can't continue a political career. It does destroy him. Trump was convicted and his political career goes on apace. Burr was acquitted, but it finished him off. But nonetheless, in that telling of the story, Hamilton is incidental. This is not the only way of telling the story of the founding. Hamilton could be a central figure. The Hamilton-Burr-Jefferson relationship, no question, was central to the period after Washington and Adams. But if you tell it through Burr's eyes, it looks very different, as it would if you told it through Jefferson's eyes. There was some talk of making a musical out of Gore Vidal's Burr. It never happened. It would be great if it did. And then the last thing I would say is that in its less than decade-long life, Hamilton's been through all of these incarnations. The music stays the same, the choreography stays the same, the cast changes, the words stay the same, but it's experienced so differently, and its reputation goes up and down, and the people who love it, some of them dig in and some of them have rejected it. Some of them think of themselves as kind of having been seduced by it and now really reject it. Some of the people who loved Hamilton most when it came out are now its staunchest critics, and vice versa. Some of the people who didn't much like it have come around to it. The fact that Dick Cheney was a fan doesn't bother people much, I think, anymore, and so on, and so on. But that story has definitely not ended. How will Hamilton seem? How will it be experienced? How will it be read if Trump wins? How will it be experienced if, as is still well within the bounds of possibility, Biden wins? What would this musical seem like if, in 6 and a bit months' time, this is the presidency of Kamala Harris? Each of those possibilities, and there may be others, probably there aren't others, but there may be others, and it may even be that the range of possibilities is shrinking by the hour since what happened yesterday. But it's a very different musical. It's a very different kind of fictionalization of American history. I think it's in many ways true to that history and in many ways not, but it's different depending on who's in the White House. That hasn't changed, and that's one of the reasons why Hamilton the musical is so completely alive. That is the end of our Great Political Fictions series, at least for now. We may be doing some more. We've got a new newsletter coming out tomorrow to go with the end of this series. If you haven't subscribed, you can sign up for free. Just follow the link that's in the show description. Coming up, we've got some extra episodes in which I'll be talking to regular contributors about their favourite political novels and plays. I'm going to be speaking to Leah Ippey, to Helen Lewis, and to Robert Saunders. But before that, we have an episode that we had scheduled anyway. We wanted to return to some of the themes of the American election series that I did with Gary Gerstle. And Gary and I had agreed to record an episode just after the Republican convention, which happens this week. So we are going to do that, and we're going to be bringing it to you on Sunday. When we agreed to do that, we didn't know just what a momentous week it might turn out to be in American politics. So all I can say is that we will have an awful lot to talk about. Do please join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future, brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books.